So I saw Lee Cronin's The Mummy today, and yes, I say today because for the first time in a long time, I actually had some extra time and was able to catch a matinee showing on release day. Now, as for my usual seizure warning, I didn't really notice too much with this film that had a lot of quick cuts or flashing lights. There are some definite moments of uneven lighting that might trigger some stuff, at least that's what I've been told. I'm not a doctor, not an expert, so those of you living with photosensitive epilepsy, use your best judgment, but should be considered relatively safe, but I don't blame you for waiting for this film to come to streaming. Now, for those of you wondering, why is it called Lee Cronin's The Mummy? Well, that's likely to differentiate it from the Mummy franchise that is owned and distributed by Universal. And I know that one's getting another film on the way, and it's kind of interesting because this film is the second outing of Blumhouse's big monster movie revival, the previous film being their take on The Wolfman. However, it's likely called Lee Cronin's The Mummy because while The Wolfman had some distribution through Universal, I think, I'll have to look that up later, this film was distributed through New Line Cinemas, which is owned by Warner Brothers, that may or may not be acquired by Paramount, but we're all kind of waiting to see how that shakes out. Point being, this is probably a Hammer horror situation where the main studio making the film is having to have it distributed through other studios, much like what happened to Hammer when they were distributing films in the US, where some were through Universal, some were through Warner Brothers, some were through Paramount. It's a whole thing. Now, when it comes to this film, in comparison to some of the other Blumhouse outings I've seen, particularly when it comes to this monster revival, I definitely have to say, I like this one better than The Wolfman, because if you recall my review of their take on Wolfman, it was one of those cases where it was a good werewolf story that shouldn't have been called Wolfman. With this film, by the time we get to the ending, I felt it had at least earned its title of The Mummy, since it does take kind of the core conceit of The Mummy, and so it does its own thing with it. So don't go into this expecting like a new take on Imhotep or Karis, or whatever the mummy was in the Hammer films. This is very much doing its own thing, and if I had to describe this film, I would simply say this film is The Mummy by way of The Exorcist, because the film very much tries to lean into more of not just gross out horror, but definitely it tries to make you unnerved and unsettled. It's out to outright disturb you in terms of the story it's trying to tell. But it does feel a little bit repetitive, as it does explore a lot of the same themes that the previous Blumhouse monster movie explored. Very much themes about family and trauma and processing, all of this stuff. It does feel a little bit repetitive, but I felt at least this tried to do something kinda unique with it, where rather than going through inherited trauma like Wolfman, this one kind of tried to go the route of, okay, well, let's explore a family living through a traumatic event. But that said, there were some parts of the story that I didn't particularly care for. It does kind of overstay its welcome a little bit, where it had like a really good ending point, but then it felt like they just had to tack something on for the sake of giving some sort of closure. It's a problem I've seen with a lot of modern horror movies, where they don't like leaving things ambiguous. They feel like they have to answer every question instead of just letting things kind of trail off and be like, okay, that's our story. Not the worst offender that I've seen, but that was definitely a bit of a bugbear. And the film does drag in a few places. I don't know if it's necessarily that it felt slow. I think it's just more me being hyper aware of certain tropes and certain beats. It just made me feel like I needed to kind of mentally skip through it. But I think that's just more of a me problem, just being aware of a lot of these tropes. Because again, it's not really reinventing the wheel. It does take some unique liberties with the premise of The Mummy. And I like how it tried to kind of update our modern understanding of Egyptology, even though it kind of shies away from trying to be authoritative in terms of what it's depicting. It doesn't really go into any major focus on any of the Egyptian pantheon or any of that like previous mummy films, and it doesn't awkwardly try to include the Abrahamic biblical curses like the 1990s take on The Mummy tried to. This one at least found a way to kind of keep things kind of unique, kind of grounded, while still having some supernatural elements to it. And one big strength is that the film was really good at building a mystery and having a good sense of payoff. It had like a good sense of build-up, good sense of payoff. It did that many times throughout the story, and so that was one thing that it was really, really, really good about, was finding a way to keep the mystery kind of satisfying and then building up to these grand reveals. It's just once you kind of get to some of the grand reveals, that's where I feel the film got a little bit overindulgent, especially during the big climax. I mean, I get it. That's probably where all the effects budget went. You want to have some nice big final moment. It makes sense. I just feel is that maybe it could have been paced a little bit better. Maybe some things could have been left a little bit more ambiguous that we didn't necessarily need to see. Again, not perfect, but I still enjoyed it, and it's definitely much better than the crappy Tom Cruise film. I mean, that's something I think we can all agree upon. And so, in terms of where I would rank this with the other Blumhouse monster films, I definitely say this is better than Wolfman. It had a bit of a tighter story. It made better use of the monster that it was essentially paying homage to, while still doing its own thing. If you're not a fan of films like the Evil Dead films or The Exorcist, this probably won't be your kind of film. It very much leans more into the gore, gross out sort of humor, as well as just being out and out ready to just straight up unnerve you and disturb you. But it's refreshing to see a mummy film, and a monster film at that, that remembers that it's supposed to be a horror film. Again, I love the Richard Sommer mummy movies, but I wouldn't really call those horror films, but rather adventure films with horror elements. This one is a straight up horror film through and through. And so if you like the Blumhouse sort of formula, if you like these horror films that are out to make you feel disturbed and unnerved, then I highly recommend Lee Cronin's The Mummy. I don't know why it's being criticized on Rotten Tomatoes. I try not to read too many critic reviews before going in to see a film so I can form my own opinion. But I personally enjoyed it. And if you're a fan of the Blumhouse sort of formula of horror films, or if you at least want something that is a monster movie, but still remembers it's supposed to be disturbing and unnerving and kind of isn't afraid to take its own risks, then I highly recommend Lee Cronin's The Mummy. So, yeah, that's it for this little review thingy. I would say I have to go lift heavy things to work off the popcorn, but technically it's my cardio day, so I guess I'll just have to, I don't know, get punched in the face later tonight, I guess? Maybe? Anyways, I will see you all next time when I next get a chance to see a movie.